Today's scripture reading will be in Philippians 2, verses 12 through and 13. Philippians 2, 12 through 13. Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure.
For our visitors who are here this morning, we've been going over a series looking at joy and how to cultivate joy. And that's been what we've been looking at through Philippians. We've actually been going through this through an expository manner. But we've been going through section by section. We come to these two verses. And before we move on, I want us to really look at this. Because these are not easy verses to put together. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at them, and then we're going to actually look at another place in the Bible where we see this playing out, and we actually see this happening. So the last few times we've been talking about joy and how to cultivate joy in relation to things like courage. Last week we talked about humility. That humility is a necessary part of joy because many of the things of God, I have to first admit that I need them in the first place. And if I'm unwilling to admit that I need God's love, if I'm unwilling to admit that I need God's help, if I'm unwilling to be humble, then I will find no joy in my Christianity. And now this morning we're moving on to our next topic, which is obedience. That obedience is a necessary part of cultivating Christian joy. Without obedience, we actually can't cultivate joy. In many ways, we'll just have guilty consciences. There's no joy in a guilty conscience. And so I want you to be thinking and asking yourself, what is obedience? How do I understand obedience? When you think about obedience, what do you think of? What comes to your mind? I want us to go to a place first in Isaiah where we see obedience explained in a very interesting way, and I specifically have the New International Version up here because I like the way they translate this passage. I often read from the ESV, but I'm going to have this up here for you, that in Isaiah chapter 28, verses 7 through 13, Isaiah chapter 28, verses 7 through 13, this is the prophet Isaiah speaking, and he's speaking about the priests and the prophets of their time. And he is condemning them. And he says, and these, that is these priests and prophets, also stagger from wine and reel from beer. Priests and prophets stagger from beer and are befuddled with wine. They reel from beer, they stagger when seeing visions, they stumble when rendering decisions. All the tables are covered with vomit, and there is not a spot without filth. Now here, he is going to pretend to be one of the priests and prophets speaking about God. And he says, who is it he is trying to teach? That's God. To whom is he explaining his message? To children weaned from their milk, to those just taken from the breast? For it is do this, do that, a rule for this, a rule for that, a little here, a little there. Very well then, with foreign lips and strange tongues, God will speak to this people to whom he said, this is the resting place, let the weary rest, and this is the place of repose, but they would not listen. So then the word of the Lord to them will become, do this, do that, a rule for this, a rule for that, a little here, a little there, so that as they go, they will fall backward, they will be injured and snared and captured. And I want us to think about this, that obedience is more than just do this and do that. And that if in our minds we think about the Word of God as only being do this and do that, then the Word of God will become to us do this and do that. And if God himself says, my words, this is the law, by the way, this is the Old Testament. If God is saying my words are more than simply do this and do that, then we should listen. We should try to understand what God is then trying to say to us. Now, I want us to look at our passage here in Philippians chapter 2. And in Philippians chapter 2, verses 12 and 13, Paul writes to the church in Philippi, "Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you both to will and to work for his good pleasure." Now, I hope something comes up in your mind about just how almost paradoxical this passage is. That Paul, on one hand, is saying, work out your own salvation. But then he's also saying God is working it out in you. And so Paul presents to us these two ideas that we're going to look at, kind of like one is the idea of free will, and the other is what we'd call something like predestination or fatalism. And I don't mean predestination as in God predestines some people to heaven and some to hell. I mean as in God designs your life and you just kind of live through it, and he just kind of steamrolls you with his will whether you want him to or not. And Paul here first tells the church, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. That's free will. You do this yourself. And what he means is, I think we understand what he means, that you decide for yourself what salvation is, how to accomplish it, but you make this decision understanding that there will be consequences. There will be good consequences and bad consequences. And so you need to be very careful about how you make your decisions, about what you decide, about what you think God is saying or not, the conclusions we come to. Which means on one hand, we have to respect one another's conclusions, even if they're different conclusions than mine, because we are to work out our own salvation with fear and trembling. I would also warn us against assuming that if someone doesn't come to the same conclusion as us, that they just need to study more and learn more. That may be true at times, but that's not true all the time, and that can actually be insulting to people who have made the effort to study and to learn things. I mean, I can speak from my own experience that I remember being in a room of people where there were 6 other people, and they all came to one conclusion, and I came to my own, and of course they wanted me to just study more. They told me, you need to, sit down with us, study with us. I hope you'll study this more. As if the thing that was lacking was my knowledge, and that's the reason I came to a different conclusion. And of course, secretly, I'm thinking to myself, well, that's your problem, right? You just need to study more. You need to learn more. And that's not really the case all the time. Sometimes people come to different conclusions, and we need to be respectful of that. So we are to work out our own salvation with fear and trembling, but then he says for, as in because. Because it is God who works in you both to will and to work for his good pleasure. So it's not just you doing it and making your own choices, it is also God acting in your life and bringing things about. It's not as simple as we like to think. And I think one of the fundamental assumptions we often make, when I say we, I mean maybe in our churches, maybe especially in our own academics and our philosophers make this assumption, that it is either free will or predestination. That it has to be one or the other. And I think Paul here is actually saying that God is so powerful that it's both. That he can actually bring something about through free will. That he can bring about his plan through free agency and choice. That's just how amazing God is. And so it's not one or the other, it's both. And so this word here, actually work out in the Greek, when you look at its tense, can be either the passive voice or the middle voice. And the middle voice is when you are acting upon yourself, and the passive voice is when someone else is acting upon you. Paul actually writes this in the Greek that it is not one or the other, it's both. So we are to work out our own salvation with fear and trembling because it is God who works in you. But there's one driving point that leads through all of this. That the way we do it is through obedience. Because in verse 12 at the beginning, he says, "Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling." He's saying, so now, as you have always obeyed, he's implying continue to obey. That we work out our salvation through obedience to God. That's actually how you learn to live, is through obedience. And what our culture teaches is so contrary to this. Our culture teaches you are raised a certain way, and then you drop that, and then you kind of go off, you have some adventures, you find yourself, and then you come to your conclusions, and then you come back. And that's actually totally contrary to Scripture, because if God is real, and we believe he is, then the only way to first go have an adventure and interact with the world is through a knowledge of God. That a knowledge of God teaches you how to interact with people, how to interact with nature, how to interact with other cultures. It is only first through a knowledge of God that you can do those things. And if we want to abandon God to go do these things, we're going to mess up all over here, and we're not even going to learn what we're supposed to learn in the first place. And the truth is, we're actually still doing it through obedience. We're just, instead of obeying God, we're obeying our cultures and customs, which tell us to go off and have an adventure. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with having adventures. We learn a lot from those things. But I am saying that it is through obedience to God that you learn how to work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. It is through obedience that we begin to see why God says the things he does. And now this may be a little complex, but I want us to now take this and understand this in the context of a different story from the Old Testament. So if you would, please turn your Bibles over to Ruth. We are going to do our best this morning to get through the entire story of Ruth. So we're not going to be reading this every single verse. But we're going to look at this story because we see a person's salvation being worked out with fear and trembling as God works in them throughout this story. That really is the story of Ruth. And what we're going to do, I think, I want to make this interesting, not just for you, for me too. I want us to look at this in terms of a 3-act structure, because I like storytelling. And Ruth, believe it or not, perfectly fits into a modern 3-act structure. And I want to be clear, I'm not suggesting that Ruth is only a story. I believe it's history. But it's very interesting that it fits into this. And so for those of you who are unfamiliar, a 3-act structure looks something like this, where you have Act 1, which is where everything is set up. You have the entire story set up. And then you have the major first plot point, which will change everything. That's where we call the inciting incident lies. And then you have Act 2, which is where the majority of the story takes place. And then you have a second major plot point, which brings the story to a climax as we then go into our resolution in Act 3. And Act 1 is only about 1/4 of the story, no more. Act 3 is 1/4 of the story and no more. And Act 2 is 50% or more of the story. And Ruth is perfectly divided up into Act 1 being chapter 1, Act 2 being chapters 2 and 3, and Act 3 being chapter 4, where it's perfectly divided up into 25%, 50%, and 25%. And so Act 1 is where everything we know about Ruth is going to be set up. And in the first act of a story, you have a number of questions you're going to ask. You're going to ask, what is the locale? Where does this take place? What time period? What's going on? You're going to ask, who are the players, the major conflicts, the major themes? Who's the antagonist? What is what we're going to call the narrative enigma? which is just to say, it's the driving question: will the boy get the girl? Will the hero save the world? Those are the driving questions in storytelling. Number 7, I have optional, and I'm going to tell you this, and after I do, you're going to see it in just about every movie you see, which is that a person is first presented with the solution to their problem, which they reject, but then they later accept. It's actually a very common technique in storytelling, and you'll see this in movies, I hope, from now on out. It's very interesting. And this actually does happen in Ruth. And then you have the first plot point, which is going to be the inciting incident, and is going to remind us of our narrative enigma, our ultimate question. So what is the locale? The locale is the days of the judges. And this is very important because when you read through Judges, you see just how depraved Israel is at this time. Judges ends with, in those days there was no king in Israel, everyone did what was right in his own eyes. That's how you end the story. Judges is just one bad turn after another as Israel goes downhill into total moral depravity. And then you come to Ruth and you come to find that during this very wicked time, something very beautiful is happening. And it's this story. So it's set up in the days of Judges, and these players are going to be returning to Judah. They had gone from Judah to Moab, Naomi and her husband, their sons, and Ruth and Orpah. And now they're returning. They're on their way back to Judah because they'd heard that there is food there. And they've been in a famine. And so they're coming back to this food. And so our major players are really going to be Naomi and her daughter-in-law, Ruth. Those are the main 2 characters. There are other players or other characters, but in the first chapter, they either die or they leave. Naomi's husband, Elimelech, dies. His 2 sons die. And then Ruth's husband, which is Ruth's husband, as well as Orpah's husband. And then Orpah, the other daughter-in-law, leaves. So our major conflicts then is going to be the death of the husbands or sons, but these women's husbands, and consequently no replacement husbands. And this becomes very fundamental to the story. In chapter 1, in verse 11, Naomi tells her daughter-in-laws, "Turn back, my daughters, why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter for me, for your sake, that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." And this is what is often called the Levirate law, which is that if a man and a woman who are married, the man dies but they have no children, then a brother or the next kinsman would marry the widow and raise up heirs for his deceased brother or kinsman. And Naomi's saying there's no one like that. And this is not a time period where women can just go get a part-time or full-time job. These women require men to be taken care of. That's why the law is there in the first place. The woman was actually allowed to demand a husband so that she could be taken care of. And there are no replacement husbands. They are basically hopeless at this point. The major themes we're going to see is first God striking people, because Naomi says the hand of the Lord has gone out against me, as well as this law, the Levirate law, that a husband or brother, a brother or kinsman would raise up heirs for a deceased husband or brother or heir. Now the antagonist of the story, very strikingly, is God. He's accused of really taking all of this from Naomi. And Naomi says, "The hand of the Lord has gone out against me." This is the one who's causing the problems. Now, many commentators, I will note, say that Naomi's husbands and their sons should not have gone to Moab in the first place. They were not allowed to go to these other cultures, and they did anyway. But really, the antagonist of the story is going to be God. And the narrative enigma, the questions we need to answer are, Will Ruth and Naomi survive, and will their faith be restored? This is all set up in chapter 1. Will they be able to survive because there's no man to take care of them? And will their faith in God be restored? The optional part here is that Naomi actually rejects the solution, but then later accepts it. The solution here partly being Ruth herself. Ruth and Orpah go up to Naomi, and Naomi tells them, you don't need to come along here. They want to go with Ruth. They want to go with Naomi. And Naomi tells Ruth and Orpah, no, go back, go to your culture, go to your gods. And Orpah does, but Ruth instead insists on going, and Naomi finally accepts. And then we come to our first plot point. Our inciting incident is that Ruth returns with Naomi to Israel. She returns to Judah with her. And this changes everything. This is this point where the story just completely turns on its head and no one knows what to expect from here on out. And then we're reminded again of what we're going to call our narrative enigma in verse 19 of chapter 1. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem, and when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, is this Naomi? And she said to them, do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? So we're reminded of the fact that will Naomi and Ruth survive, and will their faith be restored? So that's the first act, really. That's what we've just finished. We've set up everything, and we've just reached our first plot point where Ruth goes back with them and goes back with Naomi, and now everything is going to change. And so we come now to our second act, in which we're introduced to the hero, who is Boaz. And Boaz, Ruth meets him first when she goes out to glean. She goes out to glean, which was allowed under God's law. God had commanded Israel that they were not allowed to reap their entire harvest. They had to leave the edges, so that the poor and the foreigner and anyone in need could then come along and reap among the edges what was left over. And this is what Ruth is doing. She's allowed to do this. And when she goes out, she happens upon the field of Boaz, who is related to Elimelech. And Elimelech is her deceased father-in-law, Naomi's husband, who is dead. And so Boaz notices Ruth, and he offers protection. Because don't forget, this is the time period of the judges. He says, don't go out into another field lest you are assaulted, which means maybe beaten, maybe raped, maybe something awful happening to her. And so Boaz offers his protection, and then he feeds her. He invites her in and gives her bread and wine and feeds her, and then he allows her not to just glean among the edges, but to even glean with those who are harvesting, which he didn't have to do. But he does this. He recognizes Ruth's determination to take care of Naomi, and Boaz is very surprised by this. And so he wants to help her out. And so Boaz is then revealed to be a kinsman redeemer for Naomi's family. In chapter 2, starting in verse 19, and her mother-in-law said to her, where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked, and said, the man's name with whom I work today is Boaz. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. Naomi also said to her, the man is a close relative of ours and one of our redeemers. And Ruth the Moabite said, besides he said to me, you shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest. And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted. So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law. So here we have the resolution of our narrative enigma, which is at first you see that Naomi says in verse 20, may he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. Her faith in God is restored through Boaz. And then the question of will they be taken care of? Will these women actually survive is also answered in the person of Boaz. So we have the resolution first brought to us in this man, Boaz. He's the hero of the story. And then you have them, Ruth and Naomi, actively seeking a solution. Because here at the end of chapter 2, you can tell the wheels are turning for Naomi. She's thinking about something. She's plotting. She knows what can come. And so Naomi in chapter 3 begins to instruct Ruth in how to win over Boaz. She says he's going to be in the threshing floor. You go to the threshing floor after he's eaten and drinking, and you lay down by his feet, and you take a part of his clothing, and you pull it over yourself. And you wait. And he'll tell you what to do. And Naomi, after instructing Ruth, then Ruth follows Naomi's instructions. She does everything that Naomi tells her to do. And Ruth then wins over Boaz. Boaz says in verse 10, may you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do all for you, all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. She wins him over. This is the solution to the problem, right? But then there's the second plot point. The second major twist in the story that brings this story to a kind of cliffhanger, which is that there is another kinsman redeemer. In verse 12, Boaz says, and now it is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. There's someone else. And we don't know anything about this man. We don't know if he's a just man, a fair man, a righteous man. But he's someone who has the right to redeem Naomi's property before Boaz does. He's the one next in line. And this brings us now to our story reaching a critical mass. Right? This is the cliffhanger. Will it happen? And so in verse 18, Naomi tells Ruth, wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today. And that's the end of chapter 3. That's the end of our second act. So we finished up Act 2, which is the confrontation, and we've reached our second plot point now. Will everything be resolved? We had the resolution, but the resolution was just taken from us. And so now we move on into the third act, which is the fourth chapter. And Boaz, in the fourth chapter, brings 10 elders, 10 witnesses, to his confrontation with this other redeemer. And Boaz explains to him the situation that Naomi, our kinsman, is selling her land, her property. Do you wish to redeem it? And very strikingly, our jaws should drop here. The other redeemer accepts. He says, yes, I'll take it. I'll take this plot of land. But then Boaz goes on to explain that you don't just acquire the land, you will also acquire Ruth the Moabite. And you will be required to raise up an inheritance for her, to which the second redeemer rejects. And he says, well, no, I don't want to impair my own inheritance, so why don't you go ahead and acquire it? And so Boaz does, which is the resolution of the whole story, answering of our narrative enigma. Will Ruth and Naomi be taken care of, and will their faith be restored in God? And that's exactly what we see. We see Boaz marrying Ruth. He takes care of Ruth and Naomi. He takes care of both of them. And he resolves everything. So in chapter 4, verse 13, so Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age, For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. So now Naomi and Ruth are both taken care of because of Ruth being married to Boaz. And at the very end here, this story is actually revealed to be a small section of a much greater story. In verse 17 it says, they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. And we've been looking at this story, this beautiful love story. And it's not something as simple as the man gets the woman. It's that in a time of great wickedness, these people brought about King David. These are the generations that come before King David. And for us, the generations that come before Jesus Christ. And this story is revealed to be not just some little-known, unknown person named Ruth and the story of how she was taken care of. It is the story of how David came about, of how Jesus, our Redeemer, came about. And it's just one small story in a much larger story. And so now I want us to understand how this fits into Philippians chapter 2. Because it does. If you turn back over to Philippians chapter 2, in Philippians chapter 2 and verse 12, Paul says, therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Exactly what we see happening here in Paul's letter to the church in Philippi, his words are exactly what happened in the story of Ruth. That first you have people making choices freely. Right? Ruth, this entire story has people making their own choices. They have free will. They're working out their own salvation. Ruth decides to stay with Naomi while Orpah leaves. No one forced her to do that. She chose it. Boaz decides to help Ruth. No one forced him to do this. He chose it. He didn't even know who this woman was. He inquired about her, learned about her, and then continued to follow up. And the other redeemer decides not to redeem Naomi's property. He had every right to do it, even under the laws of God. And he chose not to. This is filled with people making their own choices and no one interfering, and yet God is in complete control. Because you have Naomi first crediting God with her affliction. The hand of the Lord has gone out against me. God's been doing this. And then you have Naomi crediting God with leading Ruth to Boaz. She said, the Lord has not forsaken us. He's been in charge. He's been doing this. And then at the very end, you have these women crediting God with Naomi's fortune after the birth of Ruth's child. Ruth has people making choices freely, and yet God is in complete control. And when we look back at this story, we realize it is all around obedience. The entire story comes around and comes to fruition because of obedience to the laws of God. In Leviticus 23:22, God commanded Israel not to reap to the edges so the poor could glean. That's a part of the laws of God. And yet obedience to this allowed Ruth to come in and to glean. And it facilitates the story. Boaz is a fair and just man who loves his neighbor. This is a command of God in Leviticus 10, 17, and 18. They're commanded to be just, to be fair. They're commanded to love your neighbor as yourself. Boaz is being obedient. Naomi is allowed to sell her land to her nearest redeemer in Leviticus 25:25. That's a part of the laws of God. And the fact that a kinsman or a brother has a responsibility to raise heir for a deceased family member comes around in Deuteronomy 25, 5 through 10. They were all obeying the laws of God, and yet this incredible story unfolds because of it. And this is why I read that Isaiah passage at the beginning, that the laws of God are not simply do this, don't do this, do this, don't do this. That obedience to the laws of God are how you interact with and bring the will of God about. It is how God interacts in your life. It's not as simple as do this, don't do this. I think we might like to wish it was that simple. It's not. That interacting with the laws of God, when we take it and understand it in this way, it is so much more complex and richer. And I want to leave you with this thought, that the story of Ruth is only the law of Moses. That the law of Moses brought about this incredible story. And obedience to that brought about the King David and ultimately the Christ. And that's a ministry that Paul calls a ministry of death. How much more will be accomplished in our lives as we participate in our obedience to the law of life? Right? The law of liberty of Jesus Christ. Of something much greater than the law of Moses. If God can do Ruth with just the law of Moses, imagine what he can do in our lives and accomplish in this world when we are obedient to his laws through Jesus Christ. There's something much greater and much more powerful. This series has been looking at joy and understanding how to cultivate joy, how to bring about joy. And now I think we just have one more piece of the puzzle, that obedience is a necessary part of it. And if we have this view that obedience is just do this, don't do this, we're going to miss out on a much richer and fuller view of how God participates and interacts with our life. And that obedience is a part of that. If you're here this morning and you would like to be baptized, we can do that. If you're here this morning and you need prayers, if you would like to study, if there's anything at all that the church can do for you, we ask that you would come forward now while we stand and sing the invitation song.